He's the best ever. That's what Jimmy Hart said about Hulk Hogan, the greatest wrestler of all time, right next to Ric Flair. But here's the twist. Hart also admitted Hogan was a big softy behind closed doors, his body broken from years of performing. So if the man Hart called the greatest wasn't actually the toughest, who was? Today we're diving into one of wrestling's most fascinating contradictions. Jimmy Hart, the mouth of the South, stood 5'10" and weighed 166 pounds soaking wet. He survived 4 decades in the most violent locker rooms in sports entertainment history, and he did it by knowing exactly who the real tough guys were. This isn't about who could sell the most tickets or cut the best promo. This is about who you didn't cross when the cameras stopped rolling. The men who enforced order in the chaos, the shooters, the legitimate threats. Hart's career depended on understanding this hidden hierarchy. Today, we're uncovering his true list of the 5 toughest men in professional wrestling history, the ones who made even giants afraid. Let's get into it. In professional wrestling, toughness meant 2 completely different things. For the fans, toughness was about pain tolerance. It was about working through injuries, taking brutal bumps, and never breaking character. It was Mankind falling off the Hell in a Cell. It was Stone Cold stunning his boss every week. But backstage, toughness meant something else entirely. Behind the curtain, toughness was about who could win a real fight, who had legitimate combat credentials, who commanded respect or fear when the performance ended. These were the shooters, men whose reputations kept the entire operation running smoothly. They were the invisible security system, the enforcers, the men who policed the locker room and protected the business from anyone who might expose it. For Jimmy Hart, a manager whose job was to generate heat and anger audiences, understanding this hierarchy wasn't just important, it was survival. He needed protection from the men he helped build into villains, and he needed respect from the men who actually ran the locker room. So let's break down Hart's 5 toughest wrestlers. These aren't the men he praised publicly. These are the ones he truly feared and respected. We start with the foundation of everything. Lou Thesz wasn't just a wrestler. He was the gold standard of legitimacy, a 6-time NWA World Heavyweight Champion who held the title when being champion meant something dangerous. Back in Thesz's era, the world champion had to be a hooker, someone who could win a legitimate fight if a challenger decided to go off script. And Thesz was trained by Ed Strangler Lewis, one of the most feared men in early wrestling history. During World War II, Thesz taught unarmed combat to soldiers. Think about that. The military trusted him to train men for actual life or death situations. For Jimmy Hart, acknowledging Thesz was acknowledging where the entire business came from. Wrestling was built on real fighters, men who actually knew how to break bones and end fights. Thesz represented the original blueprint of toughness that every generation tried to live up to. Hart understood that before wrestling became entertainment, it was combat. And Thesz was the man who proved that the two could coexist. If Lou Thesz represented the historical foundation, Gene LeBell was the technical genius who kept that foundation alive. LeBell was a judo and grappling champion who brought legitimate combat sports credibility into professional wrestling. He was the bridge between real fighting and stage performance, and everyone in the business knew it. LeBell's name sits alongside Carl Gotch and Billy Robinson, the catch wrestling masters who trained generations of wrestlers in legitimate submission holds. This wasn't theatrical. These techniques could genuinely hurt people. Here's why LeBell mattered to Jimmy Hart specifically. Hart managed Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart, the Hart Foundation. That connected him to the Hart family's famous dungeon, where Stu Hart trained wrestlers using the same catch wrestling traditions LeBell championed. LeBell represented something Hart could never be, authentic danger wrapped in technical mastery. Hart was all performance, all presentation, but he depended on men like LeBell, men whose skills were real, to give the entire industry credibility. LeBell didn't need to prove anything. His reputation spoke for itself. And in wrestling, that's the most dangerous kind of man. Alan Koge, 1976 Olympic bronze medalist in judo. Let that sink in. We're not talking about someone who claimed to be tough. We're talking about a man who competed at the highest level of combat sports on the planet and brought home a medal. Bad news. Brown's legitimacy was undeniable. In a business built on exaggeration and fiction, Koge's Olympic pedigree was the real deal. World-class fighting skill that no one could question. But it wasn't just his credentials. Brown had a reputation in the WWF locker room for being volatile and intense. He wasn't someone you wanted to test. And when you combine legitimate Olympic-level judo with an unpredictable personality, you get someone truly dangerous. For Jimmy Hart, who worked in the WWF during Brown's peak in the late 1980s, this was a man he saw up close. A man who represented the perfect storm of verifiable skill and genuine intensity. Here's the key contrast. Hart was a hype man. pure talk. Brown was pure action. Hart respected what he could never be, someone who didn't need to sell toughness because he actually possessed it. In wrestling's hidden economy, credentials mattered. Brown had them, and Hart knew better than to ever forget it. Harley Race was the embodiment of old-school toughness, a 7-time NWA World Heavyweight Champion, a man from the era when the champion had to be able to defend the title, for real if necessary, and Race absolutely could. The stories about Race are legendary. Marty Jannetty once tried to start a fight with Scott Hall in a hotel. Race grabbed Jannetty's forearm with a grip so intense that Jannetty immediately stopped, paralyzed with fear. Then there's the ice block story. At a social gathering, guests needed to break up a large block of ice. Race walked over, looked at it, and shattered it with one bare-handed punch. Everyone stood there in stunned silence. But here's the most telling detail. Harley Race was one of only 2 men that Andre the Giant genuinely feared. Andre the Giant, 500 pounds of human being, feared Harley Race. That tells you everything you need to know. For Jimmy Hart, Race represented the pinnacle of wrestling's territorial era, when respect was earned through toughness, not marketing. Hart made his career in the flashy WWF and WCW era, but he knew that men like Race were the foundation everything was built on. Race didn't need to talk. He didn't need a manager. His presence commanded absolute respect. And Hart, despite being all about spectacle and noise, understood that quiet dominance was the ultimate power. This isn't even a debate. Ask any wrestler from any era who the toughest man in professional wrestling history was, and you'll hear the same name, Haku, also known as Meng. Haku isn't considered tough. He's considered the toughest, universally, without question. The stories about Haku aren't just impressive, they're terrifying. In a Baltimore airport bar, 5 men questioned whether wrestling was real. Bad idea. Haku fought all 5 and admitted to biting off a piece of one man's nose during the brawl. Bobby Heenan, who managed Haku, called him the toughest man he'd ever encountered. Heenan confirmed a story that Haku once reached into someone's mouth and broke their bottom teeth with just his fingers. And here's that detail again. Haku was the other man Andre the Giant feared. Let that sink in. The 2 men who scared Andre the Giant were Harley Race and Haku. For Jimmy Hart, who worked in both the WWF and WCW during Haku's career, this was a man who represented the ultimate security system. As long as Haku was around, everyone behaved. Here's the irony. Hart publicly praised Hulk Hogan as the greatest ever. But behind the curtain, he knew Haku was the man who kept the entire operation safe. Hogan drew the money. Haku made sure nobody disrupted the business. Haku's reputation transcended kayfabe. This wasn't storyline toughness. This was real, genuine danger. The kind that kept everyone, from rookies to main eventers, in line. In Jimmy Hart's world, Haku was the apex predator. The final word, the man you never, ever crossed. So here's what we've uncovered. Jimmy Hart praised Hulk Hogan as the greatest wrestler ever. And from a business perspective, he was probably right. Hogan drew massive crowds, created iconic moments, and defined an entire era of wrestling. But Hogan wasn't tough. Hart himself admitted Hogan was soft. Meanwhile, the men who actually ran wrestling's hidden hierarchy, Haku, Race, LaBelle, Brown, and Thesz, never got that same public glorification. Why? Because their danger wasn't marketable. Hart's entire career was built on selling illusions. He was the loudest man in the room, generating heat and controversy. But that only worked because there were men willing to protect him. Men who could enforce the unspoken rules when someone crossed the line. Wrestling had a hidden economy of fear. Haku enforced it. Race embodied it. LaBelle founded it. Brown verified it. Thesz defined it. And Jimmy Hart, he understood it better than almost anyone. His longevity, 4 decades in the most volatile business in entertainment, came from one skill: knowing who actually had the power. Not the championship, not the spotlight, the physical power that made everything else possible. Here's the ultimate irony. Professional wrestling needed men like Jimmy Hart to sell it to the world. The showmanship, the music, the microphone work, that's what fans paid to see. But the business only survived because of men like Haku, Race, LaBelle, Brown, and Thesz. They were the ones who made the illusion real, who protected it, who enforced it. Jimmy Hart built a career shouting over chaos, but he only survived because he listened to the quietest men in the room, the ones everyone else feared. In a world built on illusion, Jimmy Hart's toughest wrestlers were the ones who made that illusion real. If you learned something new today, drop a like and hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories from wrestling's hidden world coming soon. Drop a comment below. Who do you think was the toughest wrestler of all time? Let's talk about it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. He was the strongest. That phrase has been thrown around about ravishing Rick Rude for decades, and wrestling fans have long believed that the man who worked as the toughest bouncer in Minnesota actually sat down and named his 6 toughest wrestlers of all time. But here's the problem. That list never existed. The idea that Rick Rude compiled a specific list of 6 toughest wrestlers is nothing more than wrestling folklore, a myth that has been passed around so many times that people just accepted it as fact. Despite all the stories and all the legends, there is no confirmed primary source where Rick Rude himself ever named exactly 6 individuals as his personal toughest wrestlers list. No shoot interview, no written account, nothing. The famous list of 6 is a construct, likely created by fans and historians who took the names of legitimately tough wrestlers from that era and attributed the list to Rude to give it credibility. So while the idea sounds amazing, the truth is that this specific list is unverified myth. But here is where things get interesting. Even though the list itself might be fake, the fact that people believed Rude could make such a list tells you everything about who he really was. Rick Rude was not some bodybuilder who pretended to be tough for the cameras. He had real credentials that made him genuinely dangerous. Before he ever stepped into a wrestling ring, Richard Rude was a Golden Gloves boxer, a professional arm wrestler, and a bouncer in Minnesota who allegedly knocked out dozens of guys with open hand slaps and punches. This was not a gimmick. This was his actual life. He worked at a club that also employed future wrestling legends like the Road Warriors and Demolition Smash, and Rude was considered the toughest bouncer there. Think about that for a second. He was tougher than the Road Warriors in real life, before any of them became famous. That level of credibility means that if Rude had actually made a list, it would have carried serious weight. Now, before we go any further, I want you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment below answering this question. Who do you think was truly the strongest wrestler of all time before you hear the rest of the list? I want to know your thoughts because this debate has been raging for years and your opinion matters. Let me know in the comments. So if the list of 6 is a myth, then what is the truth? The truth is that Rick Rude operated in an era where toughness was measured by real standards, not social media hype. The 1980s and 1990s wrestling world was built on maintaining kayfabe, the illusion that wrestling was real, and that meant you needed legitimately tough guys to protect the business. Wrestlers back then judged each other based on verified combat ability, physical durability, and psychological fearlessness. Rude fit all 3 of those categories perfectly. His boxing background gave him precision, striking power. His bouncer experience gave him real-world conflict resolution skills. And his personality gave him the kind of fearlessness that made him willing to fight anyone, anywhere, without hesitation. Jim Ross once said that Rude was born tough, had a mean streak, and truly enjoyed having a skirmish. That is not the description of a fake tough guy. That is the description of someone you do not want to mess with. The names that actually get mentioned when people talk about the toughest wrestlers of that era are Haku, Harley Race, and Bad News Brown. These are the real arbiters of toughness, the guys who everyone agreed were legitimately dangerous. Haku is universally recognized as the single toughest man in wrestling history. The stories about him are absolutely ridiculous. He supposedly refused to fall after being sprayed with mace, bit off part of a man's nose in a bar fight, and nearly ripped out an opponent's eyeball with his bare hands. Haku was so feared that even other tough guys measured themselves against him. In fact, when people talk about Rick Rude, they often say he was incredibly tough, but he was no Haku. That tells you everything about the hierarchy. Haku was the undisputed apex, the benchmark that everyone else was measured against. Then you have Harley Race, the 8-time NWA World Champion, who embodied old-school toughness. Race was so legitimately dangerous that Andre the Giant, who feared almost no one, admitted to being scared of only 2 people, Harley Race and Haku. That is the kind of respect Race commanded. He was not just a champion on screen. He was a real brawler whose reputation was built on handling physical confrontations in an era when that actually mattered. Race represented the highest standard of the traditional tough man wrestler, the kind of guy who could back up every word he said with action. Bad News Brown is another name that comes up constantly. Alan Koge was an Olympic bronze medalist in judo, which means he had certified, verifiable combat credentials. He was not playing a character. He actually knew how to hurt people. Brown and Rude were contemporaries who traveled together, and Brown remembered Rude as a really good guy and a hell of a worker. A Golden Gloves boxer like Rude would absolutely respect the discipline and proven skill of an Olympic judoka like Brown. These are the kinds of guys who define what real toughness meant during that era. And the fact that Rude is mentioned in the same breath as them shows how legitimate his own reputation was. But the myth of the list of six also includes names like Lou Thesz and Karl Gotch, the founding fathers of wrestling legitimacy. Lou Thesz was an undisputed NWA world champion who taught unarmed combat techniques to soldiers during World War II. He took wrestling techniques and applied them to actual military combat. That level of credibility would have earned immediate respect from someone like Rude, who valued verifiable fighting credentials. Karl Gotch, known as the God of Wrestling, was a master of catch wrestling and submission techniques. He could legitimately shoot on someone and turn a stage match into a real fight. Given Rude's specialized background in boxing, he would have recognized the threat posed by a master technician like Gotch, who could exploit any technical flaw and injure an opponent for real. The other name that appears on these consensus lists is Ron Simmons, who represented the bridge between the tough men of the territorial era and the athletic powerhouses of the 1990s. Simmons had a background as a dominant professional football player, and his imposing presence gave him instant authority in the locker room. He was known for maintaining order decisively, similar to the role Rude played as a gatekeeper. These are the kinds of names that make sense when you think about what real toughness meant in that era. But again, there is no evidence that Rude himself ever sat down and ranked these guys in a specific list of six. Now let's talk about Rude's actual career and the opponents he faced in his toughest on-screen feuds. In the WWF, Rude had famous battles against the Ultimate Warrior and Jake the Snake Roberts. In WCW, he fought against Sting and Ric Flair. These were his most memorable rivalries, the feuds that defined his career. But the real question is, were these guys actually his toughest opponents? The answer is complicated because there is a huge difference between who was tough on screen and who was tough in real life. The Ultimate Warrior, for example, was known for being difficult to work with backstage. He was volatile, uncooperative, and had a reputation for being hard to deal with. But there is a famous story that shows exactly where Warrior ranked compared to Rude in terms of real toughness. According to multiple accounts, including those from Ric Flair and Barry Darsow, Warrior was talking smack about Rude's family or otherwise disrespecting him backstage. Rude did not hesitate. He walked up to the powerful, muscular Warrior and knocked him unconscious with a single punch. One shot, done. Vince McMahon allegedly considered firing Rude over the incident, but it immediately demonstrated what Rude was capable of. He delivered swift, decisive justice with precision and overwhelming force. That is not the action of someone who is afraid of anyone. There is also a story, though more anecdotal, that Rude knocked out Paul Orndorff with an open hand slap. Orndorff was known as Mr. Wonderful and had his own formidable reputation for toughness. There is even a story that Orndorff once knocked out the monstrous Vader backstage when Orndorff was working as a booker in WCW. If Rude was able to subdue someone like Orndorff, it confirms his superior striking ability even against veteran legitimate tough men. However, it is worth noting that Orndorff suffered from severe nerve and spinal damage later in his career, which led to arm atrophy, so the timeline and context of any alleged confrontation is unclear. Still, the fact that these stories exist at all shows how respected and feared Rude was in real life. The most telling example of Rude's toughness came in 1994 during a match against Sting. Rude suffered a severe neck injury on the outside of the ring, but he managed to finish the match anyway. Many people cite this as the ultimate testament to his incredible toughness. He was hurt badly enough that the injury ultimately forced his in-ring retirement, but he refused to stop. He finished what he started, because that is what legitimately tough guys do. They do not quit. They do not make excuses. They push through pain that would break most people. That match against Sting was not about storylines or championships. It was about proving that Rick Rude was exactly who everyone believed he was. The irony in all of this is that the myth of the list of six exists precisely because Rude was so legitimately tough that people wanted to know who he respected. Fans and historians wanted to believe that someone with his credentials had actually sat down and ranked the toughest men in the business. It makes sense that people would attribute such a list to him because his opinion would have mattered more than almost anyone else's. But the reality is that the list is a construct, pieced together from the consensus names that always come up when people talk about legitimate toughness in wrestling. Names like Haku, Harley Race, Lou Thesz, Karl Gotch, Bad News Brown, and Ron Simmons. These are the guys who defined what it meant to be legitimately dangerous during the era when Rude was at his peak. And while we cannot say for certain that Rude ever made a specific list, we can say with absolute confidence that these are the men who would have earned his professional respect. So what does all of this mean? It means that while the list of six might be folklore, The legacy of Ravishing Rick Rude is absolutely, genuinely real. He was not a character playing a tough guy. He was a legitimate fighter who happened to work in professional wrestling. His credentials were earned in the real world long before he ever put on tights and stepped through the ropes. His reputation was built on real confrontations, real knockouts, and real moments of fearlessness that most people could never imagine. And his place in wrestling history is secured not because of some mythical list, but because of what he actually did and who he actually was. Rick Rude was the toughest bouncer at a club full of future wrestling legends. He was a Golden Gloves boxer who could deliver real punches with devastating precision. He was a man who knocked out the Ultimate Warrior with one shot and finished a match with a broken neck. He was feared, respected, and absolutely legitimate. The fact that people believed he could compile a list of the toughest wrestlers shows just how much his opinion mattered. Even if the list of 6 is a myth, the man behind the myth was undeniably real. Ravishing Rick Rude will always be remembered as one of the legitimately toughest men in the history of professional wrestling. And that legacy does not need a list to prove it. It is written in the stories, the confrontations, and the respect of everyone who ever stepped into the ring with him. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the truth behind the myth, make sure you hit that like button and share this video with your fellow wrestling fans. And do not forget to check out the rest of our content where we break down more of wrestling's biggest legends and untold stories. Thanks for watching. He was the strongest. That is how Bobby Heenan described one man. But it was not a gimmick. It was real. This was not just wrestling. These were killers. Bobby Heenan saw a bar fight once. What he watched that night changed how he thought about toughness forever. A man reached into another man's mouth with just 2 fingers. He broke the bottom teeth right off. Bobby said if he had not been there to see it himself, he would not believe it. The man who did this was calm. He was controlled. He used 2 fingers like a weapon. Bobby Heenan managed Andre the Giant. He worked with King Kong Bundy and Big John Studd. He saw the biggest, scariest men in wrestling history. But that night in the bar, he knew he had found something else. Something more dangerous than size, more dangerous than strength. He found a man who could turn violence into art. We are not talking about storyline villains here. We are not talking about characters who look mean on camera. These were legit tough guys. Guys who scared even Andre the Giant. And Bobby Heenan saw it all, up close. He spent 4 decades in professional wrestling. He started in the raw, brutal territory system of the American Wrestling Association. He moved to the big lights of the World Wrestling Federation. He ended his career in World Championship Wrestling. Everywhere he went, he kept his eyes open. He watched. He learned. He figured out who was really dangerous and who was just pretending. Bobby Heenan never released an official top 10 list. That is important to understand right from the start. There is no video of him counting down names. There is no written document with rankings. The idea of a numbered list is something fans and writers created later. They wanted it to be neat and organized, but Bobby did not think that way. He talked about toughness in stories. He mentioned names in interviews. He dropped hints over decades. And if you listen carefully to everything he said, a pattern starts to form. You start to see who he really respected, who he really feared. Heenan had strict rules for what made someone tough. It was not about how they looked. It was not about their muscles or their height. It was not even about how well they performed in the ring. Bobby Heenan cared about one thing only. Could this person hurt you for real? Not in a scripted match, not in a worked angle, but in a parking lot, in a bar, in a locker room when nobody was watching. That was the test. That was the only test that mattered. Bobby was famous for playing a coward on television. He ran away from fights. He hid behind his wrestlers. He begged for mercy. That was his character. But behind the scenes, he was the opposite of stupid. He knew exactly who could kill him if they wanted to. His survival depended on it. A manager who does not know who is really dangerous does not last long in the wrestling business, especially not in the territory days, especially not in the AWA. Bobby lasted decades because he understood power, real power, the kind that does not need a microphone or a camera. His number 1 was never in question. Bobby Heenan called one man the toughest he ever met in his entire life. Not the toughest wrestler, the toughest man. He made that distinction very clear. He broke the 4th wall to say it. In wrestling, you are supposed to protect the business. You are supposed to keep kayfabe alive. You do not admit that some guys are shoots and some guys are works. But Bobby broke that rule. He told the truth. And when a man like Bobby Heenan tells the truth about danger, you listen. There were 2 men in the world that Andre the Giant feared. Just 2. Out of everyone Andre ever met, only 2 made him nervous. Andre was 7 feet 4 inches tall. He weighed over 500 pounds. He was called the 8th wonder of the world. He was the biggest draw in wrestling history. People paid money just to see him stand in the ring. But even Andre knew there were limits. limits. Even Andre understood that size does not win every fight. He feared two men. Bobby Heenan confirmed it, and that fact alone tells you everything you need to know about toughness. Before we start counting down, understand what this list represents. These were not the best workers. They were not the biggest stars. Some of them were famous, some of them were not, but every single one of them earned respect in a way that matters. They earned it through pain, through survival, through a willingness to cross lines that normal people will not cross. Bobby Heenan watched wrestling evolve from a legitimate sport into pure entertainment. He saw the transition happen. He saw shooters become actors. He saw tough guys become characters. But he never forgot where the business came from. He never forgot the men who built it with their fists and their blood. The culture around toughness in wrestling was strange. It was almost religious. Wrestlers worshiped guys who could really fight. They told stories about bar fights and locker room beatings like they were legends from ancient times. And maybe that made sense. When your entire career is based on pretending to hurt people, you need to know who can really do it. You need a hierarchy. You need to know your place. Bobby Heenan understood that hierarchy better than almost anyone. He lived in it. He managed it. And now, through his words, we can see it too. But here's the thing nobody wants to admit. That culture was not always good. Being feared is not the same as being respected. Some of these men were heroes. Some of them were bullies. Some of them hurt people who did not deserve it. The line between enforcing order and causing chaos was thin. Bobby Heenan talked about these men with admiration. But if you listen closely, you can hear something else too. You can hear caution. You can hear the understanding that danger cuts both ways. A man who will fight for you will also fight against you. A man who breaks teeth in a bar might break yours someday. So here it is. 10 men Bobby Heenan knew were dangerous. Not a fan-made list, not a gimmick. This is built from decades of interviews and stories. This is built from the words of the man who managed Andre the Giant and lived to talk about it. If you think we missed someone, drop it in the comments. But understand that these names come from Bobby himself. They come from his criteria, his rules, his fear. Number 10, Ray Stevens. Bobby Heenan trusted very few people in wrestling. It was not that kind of business. Everybody was trying to get ahead. Everybody had an angle, but Ray Stevens was different. He was a territory veteran. He worked the AWA during its hardest years. He was known as the Crippler. That nickname was not for show. He earned it by being legitimately tough and willing to back up his skills anywhere. Stevens was a high flyer. He did moves that were ahead of his time, but that does not mean he was soft. It meant he was smart enough to work a crowd and tough enough to handle himself when the show was over. Bobby respected Stevens because he was reliable. In the territory system, reliability meant everything. You traveled together, you shared locker rooms, you depended on each other to make money and stay safe. Stevens was the kind of guy who would not stab you in the back. He would not politic. He would not try to take your spot. But if someone else tried to take his spot, Stevens would shut it down. He had the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can handle yourself. He did not need to brag. He did not need to start fights. But if a fight came to him, he finished it. Stevens worked closely with Nick Bockwinkel. Bockwinkel was one of Bobby Heenan's most important clients. That connection meant Bobby saw Stevens up close for years. He saw how Stevens carried himself. He saw how other wrestlers treated him. There was a respect there that you cannot fake. When Ray Stevens walked into a room, people paid attention. Not because he demanded it, but because he had proven himself over and over again in an era where proof was everything. The AWA was a brutal testing ground. It was not like the WWF where everything was controlled and scripted down to the second. The AWA still had shooters. It still had guys who came from amateur wrestling backgrounds. It still had guys who would stretch you if you disrespected them. Stretching meant using real holds to hurt you. It meant making you submit for real, not for the cameras. Ray Stevens survived in that world. He thrived in it. That alone puts him on this list. Number 9, the original Sheik. This man was terrifying for different reasons. His toughness was not about muscles or technique. It was psychological. The original Sheik made people believe he was insane, and maybe he was not pretending. He worked a gimmick that involved extreme violence. He used fire. He used sharp objects. He bled constantly, but the scary part was that he seemed to enjoy it. He seemed to blur the line between what was real and what was performance. That made him unpredictable, and unpredictable people are the most dangerous kind. Bobby Heenan talked about the Sheik as a legendary figure. The territory system was full of stories about him. He would show up to a town and destroy somebody, then he would leave. Nobody knew what he would do next. That kind of chaos was powerful. It kept people off balance. In wrestling, if people do not know what to expect from you, they leave you alone. They give you space. They do not test you. The Sheik understood that. He built his entire career on it. But there was a cost to that approach. The Sheik existed outside the normal structure of wrestling. He was not someone you could work with long term. He was not someone you could build a promotion around. He was a force of nature. You pointed him at something and watched him destroy it. Then you got out of the way. Bobby Heenan was smart enough to recognize that kind of power. He was also smart enough to stay far away from it. The Sheik represented a kind of toughness that was almost extinct by the time Bobby retired. Modern wrestling does not have room for guys who refuse to follow the script. It does not have room for guys who bring real danger into the building. But in the territories, that was normal. That was expected. And the Sheik was the king of it. He scared people in a way that went beyond physical strength. He scared them because he did not seem to care about consequences. A man who does not care about consequences cannot be controlled. And a man who cannot be controlled is a problem. Number 8, Stan Hansen. If you worked in Japan during the 70s and 80s, you knew about Stan Hansen. He was one of the most feared foreign wrestlers in the history of Japanese wrestling. His style was stiff. That means he hit people for real. He did not pull his punches. He did not protect his opponents the way you're supposed to. His lariat finisher was famous for knocking people out, not for the cameras, for real. Wrestlers would wake up after a match with Hansen and not remember what happened. That is not acting. That is a concussion. Hansen was unpredictable. He had bad eyesight. He wore thick glasses outside the ring, but inside the ring, he could not see clearly. That made his movements erratic. He would swing wildly. He would hit people he was not supposed to hit, and because he was so strong, every mistake was dangerous. Wrestling with Stan Hansen was like wrestling with a bull. You knew it was going to hurt. You just did not know how badly. Bobby Heenan respected Hansen because Hansen had a reputation that crossed oceans. In Japan, they loved him because he worked so hard. He gave everything in every match. American wrestlers feared him because he did not care about protecting them. That combination of respect and fear is rare. Most guys are one or the other. Hansen was both. He was beloved by fans and terrifying to his peers. The interesting thing about Hansen is that he was not trying to be mean. He was not a bully. He was just intense. He believed in making wrestling look real, and the best way to make it look real is to make it hurt. That philosophy worked for him. He became one of the biggest stars in the world, but it came at a cost. His opponents paid that cost with their bodies. And Bobby Heenan, watching from the sidelines, understood that Hansen was not someone you wanted to cross. Not because he would go after you outside the ring, but because inside the ring he might accidentally kill you. Number 7, Verne Gagne. Bobby Heenan worked for Verne Gagne for years. Gagne owned the AWA. He built it from nothing. He ran it with an iron fist, and that fist was backed up by legitimate skill. Gagne was an Olympic-level amateur wrestler. He trained under some of the toughest coaches in the world. He knew how to hook. Hooking meant using real submission holds that could break bones or tear ligaments. In the territory days, knowing how to hook was essential. It kept order. It made sure nobody got out of line. Gagne did not need to yell. He did not need to threaten. His reputation did the work for him. Everybody knew that if you disrespected Verne Gagne, he could take you to the mat and hurt you. That knowledge created a culture of discipline in the AWA. Wrestlers showed up on time. They did their jobs. They did not complain. Because if they did, Gagne would remind them why he was in charge. Bobby Heenan respected Gagne because his authority was earned. It was not based on money or politics. It was based on the fact that Gagne could back up every word he said. In wrestling, that is rare. Most promoters are businessmen. They hire tough guys to enforce their rules. But Gagne did not need to hire anyone. He was the enforcer, he was the boss, and the muscle at the same time. The AWA was built on Gagne's vision of what wrestling should be. It should be rooted in legitimate skill. It should reward athletes who had real training. It should not be a circus. Gagne hated gimmicks. He hated flashy characters. He wanted wrestlers who could wrestle, and he made sure his promotion reflected that. Bobby Heenan thrived in that environment because he understood the rules. He respected the hierarchy, and at the top of that hierarchy was Verne Gagne, a man who could break you if he wanted to, but chose to build you instead. Number 6, The Crusher. The Crusher was an AWA legend. He represented blue-collar toughness. He was not fancy. He was not technical. He just absorbed punishment and kept moving forward. That kind of durability is its own form of toughness. It is not about how hard you can hit. It is about how much you can take and still get up. The Crusher built a career on that simple idea. Fans loved him because he looked like them. He looked like a guy who worked in a factory. He looked like a guy you would see at a bar, but he could take a beating that would put most men in the hospital. Bobby Heenan saw their Crusher in his prime. He watched him work night after night in brutal physical matches. The Crusher never complained. He never asked for time off. He just showed up and did the job. That consistency built trust. It built respect. In the wrestling business, the guys who last the longest are not always the most talented. They are the ones who show up, the ones who tough it out. The Crusher was the king of toughing it out. His toughness was cultural. It came from a generation that did not believe in quitting. You worked until you could not work anymore. You hurt until you could not hurt anymore. Then you kept going. The Crusher embodied that mentality. He turned it into a character. But it was not really a character. It was who he was. Bobby Heenan understood the difference. He knew when someone was playing a role and when someone was just being themselves. The Crusher was himself, and himself was tough as nails. The partnership between Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher defined the AWA for years. They were a tag team, but they were also a philosophy. They were proof that you did not need to be the biggest or the fastest or the smartest. You just needed to be willing to endure. That willingness is what Bobby Heenan saw in the Crusher. It is what made him include the Crusher in his mental list of guys who were legitimately hard. Not hard in a flashy way, hard in a way that mattered when everything else was stripped away. Number 5, Dick the Bruiser. If the Crusher represented durability, Dick the Bruiser represented chaos. He was legitimately unhinged. He got into real bar fights. He hurt people outside the ring. His gimmick was that he was a violent brawler. But the scary part was that it was not really a gimmick. He was a violent brawler. He just happened to make money doing it in front of cameras. Bobby Heenan started his career in the AWA. That meant he was around Dick the Bruiser constantly. He saw how other wrestlers reacted to him. They were careful. They did not joke around with him the way they did with other guys. They gave him space. That kind of deference is earned. Dick the Bruiser earned it by being willing to cross lines. He did not care about the rules. He did not care about consequences. He just did what he wanted, and what he wanted was usually violent. The Bruiser blurred the line between kayfabe and reality. Kayfabe is the illusion that wrestling is real. Most wrestlers protect kayfabe by staying in character, but the Bruiser did not need to stay in character because his character was real. He was mean on camera and mean off camera. That made him unpredictable, and as we have already established, unpredictable people are dangerous. Bobby Heenan talked about the Bruiser as a defining legend of the chaotic territory era. The territories were wild. There were no corporate rules. There was no HR department. If someone had a problem with you, they handled it themselves, usually with their fists. The Bruiser thrived in that environment. He was not just surviving, he was ruling. He was one of the top guys in the Midwest for decades because nobody wanted to challenge him. Nobody wanted to find out what would happen if they did. But here's the thing about Dick the Bruiser. His toughness came with a cost. He was hard to work with. He was unpredictable. Promoters loved him because he drew money. Wrestlers hated him because he was dangerous. Bobby Heenan recognized that duality. He respected the Bruiser's toughness, but he also understood that toughness without control is just violence. And violence for its own sake does not build anything. It just destroys. Number 4, Billy Robinson. Now we are getting into a different category of toughness. Billy Robinson was not a brawler. He was not a tough guy who got lucky. He was a trained killer. He spent 8 years training at the Snake Pit under Billy Riley. The Snake Pit was a legendary wrestling school in England. It specialized in catch wrestling. Catch wrestling is one of the most brutal and effective forms of grappling ever created. It focuses on submissions, on pain, on making your opponent quit or get injured. There is no middle ground. Robinson was a premier shoot wrestler. That means he could wrestle for real, not perform, not entertain, actually wrestle. If you put him in a fight with no rules, he would destroy you. He proved that over and over again in his career. He worked in Japan where they respected technical skill. He worked in America where they respected toughness. He excelled in both places because his skills were undeniable. Bobby Heenan worked directly with Billy Robinson during a tour in Japan in 1984. He saw Robinson up close. He watched him train, he watched him work, and he understood that Robinson operated on a different level than most wrestlers. Most guys learned a few holds and some psychology. Robinson learned how to hurt people in dozens of different ways. He knew pressure points. He knew joint locks. He knew how to make a man scream without leaving a mark. Later in his life, Robinson trained MMA fighters. That tells you everything you need to know about his legitimacy. MMA fighters do not train with fake tough guys. They train with people who can teach them real skills. Robinson could teach those skills because he lived them. He spent his entire life perfecting the art of combat. Bobby Heenan recognized that perfection, he respected it, and he knew that Billy Robinson was not someone you ever wanted to face in a real fight. The interesting thing about Robinson is that he was not mean. He was not a bully. He was a craftsman. He approached wrestling the way a surgeon approaches medicine, with precision, with knowledge, with respect for the craft. But do not mistake his professionalism for weakness. Billy Robinson could kill you with his bare hands if he wanted to. He just chose not to. That choice is what separated him from the brawlers and the bullies. He had control, and control combined with skill is the most dangerous thing in the world. Number 3, Danny Hodge. If Billy Robinson was a craftsman, Danny Hodge was a machine. He was an Olympic silver medalist in wrestling. He was a semi-successful boxer. He had grip strength that became legendary. There are stories about him crushing objects with his bare hands, about him bending coins, about him cracking walnuts with his fingers. Those stories sound fake, but they are not. Danny Hodge had freakish physical strength combined with world-class technical skill. In the wrestling business, Hodge was known for being willing to stretch people. If you disrespected him, he would hurt you. Not in front of cameras, not in a match, in the locker room, in private. He would take you down and apply a hold until you tapped or until something broke. That reputation kept people in line. Nobody tested Danny Hodge. Nobody wanted to find out if the stories were true. They just assumed they were and acted accordingly. Bobby Heenan respected Hodge because his toughness was measurable. It was not based on stories or rumors. It was based on actual athletic achievement. Hodge competed at the highest levels of legitimate combat sports. He won medals, he won titles, he proved himself against the best in the world. When you have that kind of resume, you do not need to convince anyone you are tough. They already know. The thing about Hodge is that his skills were wasted in professional wrestling. He was too good. He was too legitimate. Professional wrestling is about entertainment. It is about making people believe something fake is real. But Hodge did not need to make anyone believe anything. He was real, and that made him almost too dangerous to use. Promoters were scared that he would hurt someone by accident, or that he would hurt someone on purpose if they made him angry. Bobby Heenan saw that danger. He understood that Hodge was in a category by himself, not just among wrestlers, among athletes in general. Danny Hodge was one of the toughest human beings to ever step into a wrestling ring, and the fact that most people do not know his name today shows how much the business has changed. In the territory days, everyone knew Danny Hodge. Everyone feared him. Now he is a footnote, but Bobby Heenan did not forget. He never forgot the men who could really hurt you. Number 2, Harley Race. We are now at the top 2, the only 2 men Andre the Giant feared. Harley Race was one of them. Race was an 8-time NWA World Heavyweight Champion. That means he held the most important title in wrestling during its most important era. He did not get that title because he was the best actor. He got it because he was the toughest man available. The NWA champion had to travel to different territories. He had to defend the title against local heroes. He had to make those heroes look good but still win. That job required respect, and respect in the territory system was built on the knowledge that the champion could hurt you if you tried to double-cross him. Race survived polio as a child. He survived cancer as an adult. He survived a near-fatal car crash that should have ended his career. His body was broken multiple times, and every time he came back. That kind of resilience is superhuman. It is not just physical, it is mental, it is spiritual. Harley Race refused to quit. He refused to accept that anything could stop him, and that refusal made him terrifying. Bobby Heenan and Harley Race were contemporaries in the AWA and NWA. They knew each other for decades. Bobby saw how other wrestlers treated Race. They gave him respect, not the fake respect you give to a boss because you have to. The real respect you give to someone who has proven they are better than you. Race commanded that respect through his presence. He did not need to yell. He did not need to threaten. Everyone just knew. The fact that Andre the Giant feared Harley Race is remarkable. Andre was massive. He was famous. He was protected by the entire industry because he was so valuable. But Andre knew that if Harley Race wanted to hurt him, size would not matter. Race would find a way. Race always found a way. That is what made him great. That is what made him feared. Bobby Heenan witnessed that fear firsthand. He managed Andre. He saw Andre's reactions to different people, and Andre only reacted to 2 men with genuine caution. Harley Race was one of them. Race represented old-school toughness. He came from an era where wrestling was closer to a real sport than entertainment. He carried that mentality his entire life. Even when wrestling became cartoonish in the 80s and 90s, Race never changed. He stayed hard, he stayed legitimate, and Bobby Heenan respected that consistency. In a business full of phonies and con artists, Harley Race was the real thing. He was tough when tough meant something, and he stayed tough even when it stopped mattering to most people. But let us be honest about what that toughness required. Race lived a brutal life. His body was destroyed. He was in constant pain. He could barely walk by the end. The price of being that tough was giving up a normal existence. Race sacrificed his health, his comfort, and his peace for a reputation. Was it worth it? Bobby Heenan seemed to think so. But watching Race struggle in his later years, you have to wonder. Toughness is admirable, but when it costs you everything, maybe it stops being toughness and becomes something else, something sadder. Number 1, Haku. also known as Meng, the toughest man Bobby Heenan ever met in his entire life. Not just the toughest wrestler, the toughest man. Bobby was careful about that distinction. He wanted everyone to understand that Haku was in a category that transcended professional wrestling. Haku was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with performing or entertaining. He was just dangerous. The bar fight story is what seals it. Bobby Heenan watched Haku get into a fight. The other man was being aggressive. He was pushing, he was escalating. Haku stayed calm. Then in one smooth motion, Haku reached into the man's mouth with 2 fingers, his index finger and his trigger finger, and he broke off the man's bottom teeth, just snapped them right off. The man collapsed. The fight was over. Haku walked away. Bobby said if he had not seen it himself, he would not believe it. That is important. Bobby Heenan managed giants. He managed monsters. He saw scripted violence every single day for 40 years. But that moment in the bar was different. That was real violence, real control, real power, and it terrified him. In a good way, in the way that makes you respect someone so much you never want to cross them. Haku was trained in sumo. That gave him a base of legitimate combat skill, but his reputation was not built in sumo rings. It was built in bars and locker rooms. There are dozens of stories about Haku, about him fighting multiple men at once and winning, about him being attacked and barely reacting, about him putting people in the hospital without breaking a sweat. Some of those stories are exaggerated, some of them are not. But the fact that the stories exist at all tells you something. People were terrified of Haku. The crazy thing is that Bobby Heenan also described Haku as a class man, as someone with a good heart who just wanted to work and feed his family. Haku was not a bully. He was not starting fights for fun. He was defending himself. He was protecting his reputation. In the wrestling business, your reputation is everything. If people think they can push you around, they will. Haku made sure nobody ever thought they could push him around. And he did it so effectively that even Andre the Giant was scared of him. Andre the Giant feared 2 men, Harley Race and Haku. That fact alone should be enough to convince you. But let us dig deeper. Andre was 7 feet 4 inches tall. He weighed over 500 pounds. He was beloved by fans. He was protected by promoters. He was the most famous wrestler in the world. He had every advantage. But advantages do not matter when someone is willing to hurt you for real. Haku was willing. Andre knew it. And so Andre stayed out of his way. There is another story about Haku. In 1987, there was a backstage altercation with Jesse Barr, also known as Jimmy Jack Funk. The details are murky, but the result is not. Barr ended up needing a glass eye. A glass eye. That is not a wrestling injury. That is not a bump gone wrong. That is someone destroying another person's face. Whether Haku did it on purpose or whether it was an accident, the fact remains. Haku was involved in an incident that left a man permanently disfigured. That kind of damage does not happen unless you are extraordinarily dangerous. Bobby Heenan managed Haku at various points. He worked with him closely, he traveled with him, and every single day, Bobby knew he was in the presence of someone who could kill him without much effort. That knowledge changed how Bobby approached his job. He treated Haku with respect. He never pushed him. He never played the kind of games he played with other wrestlers, because with Haku, games could get you killed. Other wrestlers confirmed Bobby's assessment. Arn Anderson, a respected veteran, created a 3-tier system for toughness. At the bottom were tough men. In the middle were wrestler tough men. At the top, in a category all by himself, was Meng. Anderson said that Meng was different, that he was legitimately dangerous in a way that no one else was. When multiple people from different eras all say the same thing, you start to believe it. But here is what nobody talks about. Haku's toughness was a prison. He could never relax. He always had to be on guard. Because if you are known as the toughest man in wrestling, everyone wants to test you. Everyone wants to see if the stories are true. Everyone wants to be the guy who beat Meng. So Haku had to be ready to fight at all times. He had to maintain his reputation through violence. That is exhausting. That is lonely. And that is the cost of being feared. Bobby Heenan admired Haku, but he also understood the burden. Being the toughest means you never get to stop being tough. You never get to let your guard down. You never get to just be a person. You are always the guy who broke someone's teeth. You are always the guy Andre was scared of. That identity follows you forever. And maybe at the end of your life, you look back and wonder if it was worth it. If being feared was better than being loved. If respect through violence is really respect at all. So there it is. 10 men Bobby Heenan knew were dangerous. 10 men who ruled locker rooms through real toughness, not scripted toughness. 10 men who made their living in a business built on lies but maintained their reputations through truth. From Ray Stevens at number 10 to Haku at number 1, these were the guys who scared even the scariest men in wrestling. But let us be clear about what this list represents. It is not just a ranking of tough guys. It is a snapshot of a culture, a culture that valued violence, that rewarded intimidation, that made heroes out of men who hurt people. Bobby Heenan participated in that culture. He celebrated it. He built his career on it. And we, by watching this video, are celebrating it too. Is that a good thing? Maybe not. Maybe we should think harder about what it means to glorify toughness. Maybe we should ask whether being feared is really something to aspire to. These men sacrificed their bodies and their peace for a reputation. They lived in constant pain. They died young. They left behind stories of violence that we now consume as entertainment. The territory system is gone. The culture that created these men is gone. Wrestling today is safer. It is more controlled. It is less real. And that is probably good, because the realness came at a cost. The toughness came at a cost. Every one of these men paid that cost. And when you add it all up, you have to wonder if it was worth it. Bobby Heenan died in 2017. He lived a long life. He saw wrestling change from a rough, dangerous business into a corporate entertainment machine. He saw the tough guys disappear. He saw them replaced with athletes and performers. And maybe he missed the old days. Maybe he thought the business was better when it was more real. Or maybe in his final years, he understood that real violence is not something to celebrate. That toughness is not the highest virtue. That being feared is not the same as being respected. We will never know what Bobby really thought. We just have his words, his stories, his memories of the toughest men he ever met. And those memories give us a window into a world that does not exist anymore. A world where your survival depended on knowing who could hurt you. A world where respect was earned through pain. A world where 2 fingers in a man's mouth could break his teeth and end a fight before it started. That world is gone, but the stories remain. And as long as we keep telling them, those 10 men will live forever. Not as heroes, not as villains, but as something more complicated. As men who were dangerous, men who were respected, men who were feared, men who Bobby Heenan, the greatest manager in wrestling history, knew you did not mess with. So there it is. Not a fan-made list, not a gimmick, but the 10 men Bobby Heenan knew were dangerous. If you think we missed a name, drop it in the comments, like the video if you learned something, and subscribe, because we have got more legends to unpack, more stories to tell, more forgotten history to resurrect. The territory days are over, but their legacy lives on, in stories, in memories, and in lists like this one. He's the strongest, the most legendary wrestler who ever lived. A Superman who claimed he feared no man, no beast, and no evil. But when you dig deeper into Hulk Hogan's career, you realize that his version of toughness was carefully crafted, politically motivated, and often conveniently selective. The men he called his toughest opponents were mostly the ones who made him look invincible. The guys who truly scared him, they barely got mentioned. This is the real story behind Hogan's list of 10 toughest wrestlers, and it reveals more about his ego than about actual danger. For 4 decades, Hulk Hogan dominated professional wrestling with a carefully constructed persona. He was the ultimate hero, the all-American champion who always prevailed against impossible odds. His public statements about opponents need to be understood not as objective reporting, but as essential pieces of maintaining the Hulkamania mythology. Everything Hogan says publicly serves one purpose: keeping himself at the center of wrestling history as the biggest draw and most dominant figure ever. That means his list of toughest opponents isn't really about who was tough. It's about who helped his career the most. The confusion starts with the word toughness itself. In professional wrestling, toughness can mean 3 completely different things. First, there's historic rivalry toughness, which means opponents who drew big crowds and made Hogan money. Second, there's physical stiffness, which refers to dangerous workers who hurt people in the ring. Third, there's legitimate shoot prowess, meaning real fighters who could actually destroy you outside the scripted world of wrestling. Hogan almost always favored the first type, carefully managed the second, and completely avoided acknowledging the third. His public list reflects this calculated approach to legacy building. When Hogan talks about his toughest opponents, he's really listing the people who were essential to making him a legend and helping wrestling conquer the world. These weren't necessarily the most dangerous men he faced. They were the necessary hurdles he needed to overcome to maintain the top position for 2 decades. The canonical list that gets repeated in interviews and documentaries includes names that marked major milestones or provided dramatic friction that sold tickets. But selling tickets and being genuinely tough are 2 very different things. Let's start with number 10 on the real composite list, working our way down. At number 10, we have Meng, also known as Haku. This placement reveals everything wrong with Hogan's public narrative. Meng was universally considered the toughest man in professional wrestling, not just the toughest wrestler. Ric Flair called him the toughest person he'd ever met in his entire life and said if Meng had pursued mixed martial arts, he would have dominated everything. Arn Anderson, himself a notoriously tough figure, confirmed Meng's status as the gold standard of legitimate fighting ability. The most telling endorsement came from Bobby Heenan, who managed countless wrestlers and saw everything. Heenan declared Meng the toughest man he ever met, recounting how Meng once used just his index and trigger fingers to break a man's bottom teeth during a bar fight. Think about that level of strength and violence. But here's the critical detail. Heenan said the only two men Andre the Giant ever feared were Meng and Harley Race. Since Andre was Hogan's most defining opponent, the fact that Andre feared Meng provides a profound measure of where Meng stood in the locker room hierarchy. Yet Meng never appeared on Hogan's public lists of toughest opponents. Why would Hogan exclude the most legitimately dangerous man in wrestling from his toughest opponents list? Because acknowledging Meng would mean admitting someone existed who could genuinely destroy him. That doesn't fit the narrative of fearing no man. Interestingly, there are documented instances where Meng got into backstage confrontations, and other wrestlers were too afraid to intervene. Hulk Hogan, who Meng reportedly respected, was sometimes called upon to calm him down. This reveals a pragmatic reality underneath Hogan's bravado. Despite publicly declaring he feared nobody, Hogan understood the political necessity of maintaining good relationships with people possessing verifiable fighting skills. He knew Meng represented genuine, life-threatening toughness that existed completely separate from theatrical toughness. The fact that Hogan could influence the most feared man in the locker room shows he recognized real danger when he saw it, even if he'd never publicly admitted. At number 9, we find Big Van Vader. If Meng represents the shooter Hogan quietly respected, Vader represents the physical danger Hogan actively tried to minimize and control. Vader was a powerful opponent with surprising agility for his size, capable of performing a moonsault despite his massive frame, but he was notoriously stiff in the ring, meaning he worked dangerously and hurt people. Eric Bischoff explicitly documented that Hogan was hesitant to work with Vader because he wasn't interested in working that way. Vader had a history of seriously injuring opponents, including breaking someone's back and rupturing Sting's eardrum. Hogan required assurance that Vader would have his head on straight and wouldn't try to over-impress anybody with unnecessary physicality. This reluctance is crucial for understanding what Hogan really meant by tough. Hogan was a work-safe top draw who preferred to avoid legitimately dangerous workers. The operational conflict between them reached its peak during their feud in 1995. At Super Brawl V, Hogan famously no-sold Vader's signature powerbomb, meaning he acted like the devastating move had no effect on him whatsoever. This wasn't just bad psychology for the match, it was Hogan's way of neutralizing the perceived physical threat. By refusing to legitimize Vader's offense, Hogan prioritized protecting the Hulkamania formula over maximizing Vader's credibility. If Vader appeared too genuinely tough, Hogan would seem less superhuman, threatening the established box office formula that had made him millions. Hogan's concept of a tough opponent often excluded those who posed legitimate, unplanned risk of injury in a worked environment. He focused on self-preservation and protecting the scheduled outcome, which makes sense for a top guy, but it also reveals that his toughest opponents list was never about who could actually hurt him. Moving to number 8, we have The Rock. This rivalry represented the ultimate generational clash. By the time they faced off, Hogan was well past his prime, but the match proved he could still main event and draw massive crowds in the modern era. The Rock was the toughest generational challenge WWE had produced in the 2000s, a new type of superstar who combined athleticism, charisma, and microphone skills in ways that made him a legitimate threat to Hogan's legacy. Beating The Rock allowed Hogan to prove his longevity and relevance. This wasn't about physical danger or legitimate toughness. It was about Hogan conquering the new guard and showing he could still hang with the best the business had to offer. The Rock made Hogan look timeless, which is exactly what Hogan needed at that point in his career. At number 7 sits the Iron Sheik. He was the foundational antagonist, the first truly important opponent who launched Hulkamania into existence. Hogan defeated the Iron Sheik in 1983 to win his first WWF World Heavyweight Championship. This wasn't just a title change. It was the genesis moment that established the Hulkamania character and began Hogan's dominant run. The Iron Sheik's role was crucial as the initial powerful foreign heel that the all-American hero had to overcome. Without this victory, there's no Hulkamania era as we know it. The Iron Sheik was tough in the sense that he represented the perfect starting point for Hogan's mythology. He was credible enough to make the win meaningful, but positioned correctly for Hogan to triumph and begin his ascent. Sting comes in at number 6. He became the symbolic WCW antagonist during the NWO era, the moral compass of the company standing against Hogan's villainous turn. Their rivalry was central to both the rise and fall of WCW as a promotion. Sting represented everything pure about wrestling, while Hogan led the corrupt NWO faction. This dynamic required a transition from Hogan's defining heel run back toward facing a legitimate babyface threat. Sting's drawing capacity as an adversary proved essential during this period. He was tough because he could carry an entire promotion on his back and serve as Hogan's opposite number during one of the most financially successful periods in wrestling history. Sting made Hogan's heel work believable and gave fans someone to root for. Against the Hollywood Hogan character, the Ultimate Warrior lands at number 5. This placement might surprise people because Warrior isn't always included in these discussions, but his intense, high-energy style and unpredictable nature made him a genuine challenge. Warrior was often cited among Hogan's toughest opponents specifically because of how physically demanding their matches were and how legitimate the intensity felt. Warrior was also notoriously difficult to work with behind the scenes, creating a different kind of toughness that Hogan had to navigate. Their feud represented a clash of two superhuman characters, which was rare for Hogan. Usually, he was the only Superman in the ring. With Warrior, he faced someone who matched his intensity and couldn't be easily controlled or predicted. This made Warrior tough in multiple dimensions, both as a physical challenge and as a political one backstage. At number 4, we find Ric Flair. Flair represented the ultimate interpromotional war and the clash between two distinct eras and styles. Hogan brought cartoon spectacle and larger-than-life heroism. Flair brought technical proficiency, old-school psychology, and the heritage of the NWA territory system. Their dream match symbolized the unification of wrestling's two biggest stars from competing visions of what the business should be. By overcoming Flair, Hogan solidified his legend by conquering what many considered the toughest challenge of the NWA and WCW circuit. Flair's toughness came from his ability to make people believe in his matches through pure skill and storytelling rather than superhuman gimmickry. Beating Flair meant Hogan proved he could hang with the best pure wrestler of his generation, even if their styles were completely incompatible. Randy Savage, the Macho Man, sits at number 3. This rivalry holds a special place because it introduced emotional depth to Hogan's work that hadn't existed before. The disintegration of the Megapowers wasn't just about two big stars fighting, it was about professional jealousy, personal betrayal, and the destruction of friendship. The feud demonstrated Hogan's capacity for executing deep psychological storytelling rather than just superhuman feats of strength. Savage proved that the toughest adversary could be an internal one, centered on complex emotions that fans could relate to. Their matches had genuine heat because fans had invested in their partnership and felt betrayed when it fell apart. Savage was tough because he pushed Hogan into territory where being physically dominant wasn't enough. You needed acting ability and emotional range to sell the story properly. Roddy Piper claims the number 2 spot. Roddy Piper was arguably the perfect psychological foil for everything Hogan represented. Where Hogan was the all-American hero, Piper was the rebellious troublemaker. Where Hogan inspired hope, Piper generated hatred and chaos. Piper's status as arguably wrestling's greatest heel provided Hogan with an eternal antagonist throughout the mid-80s. Piper's ability to maintain intense hatred from crowds across multiple promotions and eras proved his value as a narrative opponent. His toughness came from his unmatched ability to make people despise him, which made Hogan's victories over him that much sweeter. Piper could cut promos that got under your skin and made you genuinely want to see him get beat up. That's a rare talent and one that was essential to Hogan's drawing power during the most successful period of his career. Finally, at number 1, we have Andre the Giant. This wasn't just Hogan's toughest opponent, it was the defining moment of his entire career and arguably the most important match in professional wrestling history. Andre represented a symbolic hurdle that seemed impossible to overcome. He was massive, legendary, and had never been truly defeated in the way Hogan would need to defeat him. The body slam at WrestleMania 3 became the single most iconic moment of the 1980s wrestling boom. Hogan lifting Andre proved he was a legitimate Superman in the eyes of millions of fans. This victory redefined what was possible in wrestling and cemented Hogan's narrative as authentic rather than just manufactured. Andre's toughness was his sheer size and presence. He didn't need to be stiff or shoot on anybody. His existence as an apparently unmovable object made him the perfect final boss for Hogan to overcome. Now here's where Hogan's carefully constructed narrative starts to fall apart. Notice what these 10 names have in common. They're all people who made Hogan look better by losing to him or by drawing money in feuds with him. Only 2 of them, Vader and Meng, represented genuine physical danger that Hogan actually wanted to avoid. The rest were perfect professional opponents who knew how to make Hogan shine. His public list of toughest opponents is really a list of who was most essential to his mythology, not who actually scared him. The people Hogan claims as his toughest opponents rarely overlap with the people he showed genuine physical caution around. He required special assurances before working with Vader because of the injury risk. He maintained careful political relationships with Meng because everyone knew Meng could legitimately hurt anyone he wanted. But publicly, Hogan's narrative focused on the theatrical rivalries that sold tickets and made him look invincible. This reveals the calculated nature of how Hogan manages his legacy. Every story serves the purpose of maintaining his status as the biggest star who overcame the biggest challenges. Consider what's missing from Hogan's public discussions of toughness. He frequently makes disputed claims about working with modern power wrestlers like Brock Lesnar, someone with extreme legitimacy due to his amateur wrestling and MMA background. These claims are often proven false, showing Hogan's tendency toward revisionist history and self-aggrandizement. He wants the association with Lesnar's shooter reputation to bolster his own legendary status with contemporary fans, even if they never actually had significant matches. This pattern of inflating or inventing connections to legitimately tough people shows Hogan understands what real toughness looks like. He just prefers to claim association with it rather than acknowledge where it actually existed in his career. Discussions of Hogan's most difficult opponents frequently mix up legitimate physical danger with challenging backstage personalities or ego battles. Wrestlers like Bret Hart, Scott Steiner, and Shawn Michaels appear on lists about having heat with Hogan or being difficult to work with. These challenges required political or psychological toughness to overcome, but they're completely separate from real-life physical durability or stiff in-ring styles. Hogan conflates all these different types of difficulty into one narrative of overcoming tough opponents, but the reality is far more nuanced. Some guys made him money, some guys risked hurting him, some guys he had personality conflicts with. These are different things, but Hogan presents them all as versions of the same challenge he heroically overcame. The three-dimensional framework of toughness reveals how Hogan manipulated the narrative. Historic rivalry toughness meant main event drawing power and defining feuds. This is where Andre, Piper, Savage, Flair, Sting, the Iron Sheik, and The Rock fit. They were essential to Hogan's box office success and helped establish his legendary status. Physical stiffness toughness meant dangerous workers who imposed real physical tolls on opponents. This is where Vader fits, and it's notable that Hogan actively tried to minimize and control this type of toughness because it threatened his safety and his formula. Legitimate shoot toughness meant demonstrated real-life fighting prowess that commanded locker room respect. This is where Meng fits, and it's telling that Meng appears nowhere on Hogan's public list despite being universally acknowledged as the toughest man in the business. Hogan's approach to each type reveals his priorities. He embraced historic rivals because they made him rich and famous. He tolerated physical workers like Vader, but implemented strategies to protect himself and neutralize their credibility when necessary. He respected legitimate shooters like Meng from a distance, maintaining political relationships without ever publicly acknowledging that they represented a level of toughness he couldn't match. This calculated approach makes perfect sense for a top draw protecting his position, but it also means his public statements about toughness are fundamentally dishonest. They're marketing, not reality. The exclusion of certain names from Hogan's narrative is as important as the inclusion of others. Nick Bockwinkel represented the older guard of AWA legitimacy and territorial wrestling history that Hogan transcended. Bockwinkel appears on some versions of the list to lend historical weight to Hogan's claim of national dominance, but he wasn't particularly tough in any meaningful sense beyond representing an era of wrestling. Similarly, Hogan's public list sometimes includes Vince McMahon and Bobby Heenan, a corporate figure and a manager. Their inclusion proves that when Hogan talks about toughness, he's really talking about narrative significance and who was essential to his success. McMahon represents the political and corporate landscape Hogan had to navigate. Heenan represents the managerial genius who built stables of opponents for Hogan to defeat. Neither one could actually hurt Hogan physically, but both were tough challenges to his career longevity in different ways. This brings us to the fundamental dishonesty in Hogan's legacy management. He presents himself as someone who feared no man and overcame every challenge through sheer will and superhuman ability. But the reality is that Hogan was extraordinarily careful about which challenges he took on and how he navigated them. He avoided legitimately dangerous workers when possible. He no-sold moves that might make him look vulnerable. He maintained strategic relationships with the genuinely tough guys backstage so they wouldn't expose him. He cherry-picked opponents who would make him look good rather than those who presented actual risks. None of this diminishes his accomplishments as a draw, but it does reveal that his narrative of fearlessness is carefully manufactured. The most frequently circulated top 10 list of Hogan's rivals demonstrates how narrative shapes perception. That canonical list serves as a roster of historic rivals who bolstered his drawing power and defined Hulkamania. It's presented as a measure of toughness, but it's actually a measure of professional value to Hogan's career. The private locker room history tells a completely different story, one populated by individuals who were genuinely tough due to in-ring style or legitimate fighting prowess. These are the figures Hogan approached with caution or pragmatic respect, but they rarely appear in his public mythology because acknowledging them would undermine his Superman persona. Professional wrestling requires a delicate balance between worked cooperation and the appearance of legitimate conflict. The best workers understand how to create the illusion of intense violence and competition while actually protecting each other and ensuring nobody gets hurt unnecessarily. Hogan mastered this balance better than almost anyone, which is why he stayed on top for so long. But his mastery came from carefully selecting who he worked with and how those matches were structured. He didn't randomly face the most dangerous opponents. He faced the opponents who could make him look the most impressive while minimizing actual risk to his health and his position. The Vader situation perfectly illustrates this dynamic. Vader was over. As a monster heel, physically impressive, and could work at a high level. He should have been a perfect opponent for Hogan, but Vader's stiffness and history of injuring people made him a genuine threat to Hogan's safety and his carefully crafted invulnerability. So Hogan worked with him, but implemented protective measures. He required assurances about Vader's behavior. He structured the matches to minimize risk, and when necessary, he no-sold Vader's biggest moves to prevent Vader from looking too dangerous. This wasn't cowardice. It was smart business by a top draw protecting his position. But it also reveals that Hogan's relationship with truly tough opponents was based on control and mitigation rather than legitimate conquest. The Meng situation reveals an even deeper truth. Meng could have legitimately hurt anyone in the locker room at any time. Everyone knew this. Wrestlers who got into confrontations with Meng had to be carefully managed because the potential for real violence was always present. Hogan's ability to calm Meng down during backstage incidents shows he understood the importance of maintaining good relationships with people who possessed real power. This pragmatic political skill was essential to Hogan's longevity, but it contradicts his public narrative of fearing nobody. If you truly fear no man, you don't need to carefully manage relationships with legitimately dangerous people. You just beat them up or ignore them. Hogan couldn't do either with Meng, so he maintained respectful distance while never publicly acknowledging Meng as one of his toughest challenges. The emotional and psychological rivalries with people like Savage and Piper were tough in their own way. Creating compelling storylines that fans invest in requires serious skill and chemistry between performers. Hogan's ability to execute these complex narratives proved he was more than just a muscular Superman character. He could act, sell emotion, and make people care about wrestling storylines beyond just who won and lost. These rivals were tough because they pushed Hogan creatively and forced him to develop new dimensions as a performer. But this is still fundamentally different from physical or legitimate toughness. It's professional difficulty, which is important but not the same as danger. The generational challenges from people like the Ultimate Warrior and The Rock tested Hogan's ability to stay relevant across different eras. Wrestling changed dramatically from the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s. New styles emerged, audience preferences shifted, and different types of stars became popular. Hogan's willingness to adapt and face these new challenges showed professional toughness and longevity. But again, these weren't dangerous opponents in any legitimate sense. They were professional tests of whether Hogan could still draw money and command audience attention against fresh competition. He passed these tests, which speaks to his enduring appeal, but it doesn't make these opponents physically or legitimately tough. The inter-promotional rivalry with Flair deserves special attention because it represented a clash of wrestling philosophies. Flair embodied technical wrestling, long matches, and the NWA tradition of world champions who could work an hour and make it compelling through pure skill. Hogan embodied spectacle, short explosive matches, and the WWF tradition of larger-than-life characters who drew through personality and presence. When they finally faced off, it was a test of which approach would prevail in the public's mind. Hogan winning these matches reinforced that his style of wrestling was dominant, at least commercially. But Flair's technical superiority was never really in question. The matches weren't about about who was the better pure wrestler. They were about whose brand of wrestling would make more money. Hogan won that battle, but it was a business victory more than a competitive one. The foundational role of the Iron Sheik reveals how Hogan's entire mythology was built on carefully selected opposition. The Sheik was credible enough to hold the WWF title and intimidating enough with his foreign heel gimmick to seem like a serious threat. But he was also perfectly positioned to lose to Hogan at exactly the right moment to launch Hulkamania. This wasn't an accident. The booking was designed to make Hogan look like a conquering hero overcoming a dangerous foreign menace. The Sheik's toughness was entirely in service of making Hogan's victory meaningful. In legitimate terms, there were probably dozens of wrestlers tougher than the Iron Sheik, but none of them served the narrative purpose he did at that specific moment. Looking at the complete picture of Hogan's career reveals a man who was extraordinarily skilled at legacy management and self-promotion. Every choice, every rivalry, every public statement served the purpose of maintaining his position as the biggest star in wrestling history. The list of toughest opponents isn't really about who was tough. It's about who was most useful to the Hulkamania narrative. The genuinely tough guys, the ones who could have legitimately hurt Hogan or exposed his limitations, were either carefully managed into safe roles or excluded from the public narrative entirely. This doesn't diminish Hogan's accomplishments as a performer and draw. He was genuinely great at his job, which was making money and entertaining audiences. He stayed on top longer than almost anyone, survived multiple scandals and controversies, and remains one of the most recognizable names in all of entertainment. These achievements are real and impressive, but they were accomplished through careful calculation, strategic avoidance of genuine threats, and masterful manipulation of public perception. The toughest opponents weren't the scariest people. They were the most useful people for building and maintaining the Hogan mythology. The contrast between Hogan's public statements and the locker room reality reveals the gap between kayfabe and shoot, between the work story and legitimate truth. Publicly, Hogan feared no one and conquered all challenges. In reality, he avoided dangerous workers, carefully managed relationships with legitimate tough guys, and structured his matches to protect his health and his persona. Both versions serve a purpose. The public version sells tickets and maintains the mythology. The private version keeps him safe and employed for decades. Understanding both is essential to accurately assessing what his list of toughest opponents really means. In the end, Hulk Hogan's definitive list of toughest wrestlers reveals more about how wrestling works than about who was actually tough. Professional wrestling is a cooperative performance art designed to create the illusion of legitimate athletic competition. The best performers understand how to make that illusion compelling while protecting themselves and their opponents. Hogan mastered this better than almost anyone, which is why his career lasted so long and made so much money. But mastery of the illusion requires constant maintenance of the narrative, which means the story Hogan tells about his toughest opponents is necessarily different from the complete truth. The men he feared most were never in his story, and that omission tells you everything you need to know about how legends are really built in professional wrestling.